having me. So next slide, please. So as you all know, Governor DeSantis, when he came into office, he appointed 5 of us scientists to the Blue-Green Algae Task Force. Next slide, please. And these are a name of the names of the 5 individuals here. So myself as basically the West Coast representative, 3 representatives from the East Coast with Evelyn Geyser, Valerie Paul, and Jim Sullivan, and then Wendy Graham from the University of Florida up in Gainesville. Next slide, please. So we were appointed in May of 2019. We had several meetings that year in which we put together a document that was basically the Blue-Green Algae Task Force consensus document. So I have the link for this shown here, and it had a bunch of recommendations. I just have them as bullets here. And we sent them right to the governor's office. The governor met with the leadership within the legislature and within the executive branch, and basically wanted to see action taken on these different items here. And so many of these were incorporated in the Clean Waterways Act, as many of you know, in 2020, which was signed into law and basically was put into action in 2020. Next slide, please. And so basically, when these were put, when the Clean Waterways Act was put into play, the Blue-Green Algae Task Force was asked, you know, what do you guys think? Is your job done? What do you think your next tasks are going to be? And we answered that no, our job is really just beginning. And we really want to see how this Clean Waterways Act is being implemented and evaluated. These are the first steps in taking action with the blue-green algal bloom problems and the nutrient loading problems that we have here. So let's see what's happening since the Clean Waterways Act was implemented. So these next several slides are basically just summaries of the different meetings we've had over the past year. This should be June 2021. It's a typo on the top, so I apologize for that. But just a summary over the past year where we basically asked the different agencies and the divisions within the agencies to provide updates on what they've done since the Clean Waterways Act was implemented, and really more of a fact-finding mission for the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, and asking questions about what progress was being made. So first of all, here we have innovative technology. So this was last June. Again, that'd be June 2021. And so we had various state agencies and divisions within the agencies providing overviews of how these innovative technologies are being implemented. And as Dr. Rosen mentioned, he's been involved in some of the testing of these innovative technologies. There are many projects that are underway that are part of the Innovative Technologies Grants Program. And so there are several projects at Florida Gulf Coast University and many of the other universities throughout Florida and other non-for-profit or government agencies that are trying out these technologies. They seem to work in some cases, but not in other cases, as Dr. Rosen mentioned. Nothing seems to be 100% effective. So it seems to be, you know, can we at least mitigate these blooms? We're not going to be able to completely remove the blooms. And so it kind of comes to a cost benefit analysis, really. How much effort do you want to put into reducing these blooms, knowing that they probably will be coming back? Are you just throwing $100 bills into the water and watching them sink to the bottom? Or what does it really make a difference? So there is an economic component and an evaluation process that's evolving to really help to look at the performance of these. But we have to start this process. So that's where this grants program comes into play. We heard from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and the South Florida Water Management District on how they were expanding their monitoring network on Lake Okeechobee and how they were trying to work together better. As you all know, state agencies, federal agencies, maybe even on a county level for that matter, the different agencies don't necessarily communicate well, or they don't have the means of being able to exchange information or collaborate based on whatever mandates or legislative rules are in place. And so there are some hurdles there. And I'll talk a little bit about that on the following slides. But the South Florida Water Management District and the DEP found a way where they could basically work together and expand this monitoring network. So they have more sites and they're sampling some sites more frequently, trying to look at the gaps in the sampling. And lastly, with cyanobacteria control, there were some specific examples of some of these technologies. As Barry mentioned, the nanobubble technology is one such technology that's being utilized and tested right now. There are various hydrogen peroxide type products and procedures out there, treatments, I guess would be a better word, that have also been tried. And so I think from an innovative technology point of view, we're moving forward on some technologies, maybe some more established technologies. Some of you may remember I think it was Lake Solutions Group out of Israel. They came and did some treatments near Franklin Lock. And I got a lot of questions on, well, how can a group from Israel get to do a demonstration project and get a contract with the state, whereas me here in Fort Myers, I can't even get my name on the list. And so I think part of this is there needs to be a better line of communication on how people can get the attention of the DEP in the state, and maybe streamline the process and make it clearer, because it's not easy for the average person to know how to work their way through the system, or someone in business if they're not necessarily familiar with grants and working with the state in that way. And so that was something that came up, and the TF stands for the task force. So we talked about these various issues, how these technologies, how well they work, a need to monitor their performance, and really a good experimental design. You could, for example, apply some of these treatments in a canal in Cape Coral, and maybe have a canal, just a quarter mile downstream, let's say. And if your treatment canal, if all the algae goes away, you might say it worked, but what if all the algae went away in the canal where you did nothing? So it seems like the algae just went away by itself. As Dr. Rosen mentioned, they will lose or they will expend some of their resources, exhaust some of their resources, I guess is a better word. And then they end up starving themselves, and they'll create these mats on the surface and decompose and die. So that can happen naturally, so without treatment. So you really need a good experimental design to really test the performance of these. There may be unintended consequences. So when you do hydrogen peroxide treatments, for example, it not only kills the cyanobacteria, or it's not only targeting the cyanobacteria, but it will target bacteria, it will target other microalgae, it'll target larval fish eggs, so on and so forth. So when you get to larger organisms, it probably is not that harmful. If you think about it with people, for example, we use hydrogen peroxide for wounds. We use it as mouthwash. I think some people use it to bleach their hair. So it's not necessarily harmful to larger organisms, but smaller ones, it can be lethal. Limitations of some technologies. Some technologies may only treat the surface. Well, as Dr. Rosen mentioned, many of these cyanobacteria move up and down in the water column. So that treatment won't be effective for the rest of the population that's deeper. But one thing we continually bring up in all of our meetings is that we really need to be looking at the nutrients. The algae are a symptom of the nutrient loading. So we really need to get back to where the nutrients are, what the nutrient sources are. And that was something we talked about with the monitoring expansion on Lake Okeechobee. We need to find the hot spots. Where are the nutrients really coming from? As one of the board members mentioned earlier in Pahokee Marina, was it some of the wastewater coming from the boats? Is that a hot spot? Is it a pasture up the Kissimmee River? Is that a hot spot, or Fish Eater Creek? So we don't have data, or we haven't identified these hot spots. And so that's something that we would like to see happen as a task force. Maybe the data are there, but they're just not public. But that's something that we really need to get a strategic sampling plan in place on this. Next slide, please. I'll try to speed it up a little bit. I think I'm going a little slow. 2 months later, last August, then we had a meeting where we had an update on the stormwater system. So one of our recommendations was that we need to look at both wastewater treatment, and we need to look at the stormwater retention ponds, detention ponds, so on and so forth. So in either case, we either have power failures in wastewater treatment plants that result in untreated water being discharged into our waterways, or we have retention ponds and detention ponds that just aren't effective anymore. They're actually becoming nutrient sources instead of nutrient sinks. So we had an update from a technical advisory committee that was put together for stormwater. And this was one of the first steps that DEP did following the Clean Waterways Act. And so they gave us a quick update on this technical advisory committee. They mentioned that there were new best management practices that were being put in place, but it primarily addressed new construction. And the idea was, well, how can we make a better pond? And so here are some guidelines that the pond should perform better. One of our responses were that they were really focusing on total suspended solids, whereas we think the problem, again, should be the nutrients. It should be the nitrogen and phosphorus inputs. So maybe they should be looking at performance from nitrogen and phosphorus reduction points of view rather than total suspended solids. It still relies a bit on presumed compliance. And so if you build the pond this way, it should perform like that. But we know for a fact that many of these ponds are not performing well. And they are sources of nutrients. And that brings up the second from the bottom bullet here. None of this addressed the ponds that are already in existence. And we know many of these are decades old, and we know they're just not working anymore. So what are we going to do about them? Instead of worrying about just the new ones that are being built, we need to address the old ones. And there's a need, again, to monitor the currently existing ponds to see which ones are underperforming. We need to identify them. We need to prioritize which ones are the biggest problems, and we need to find solutions on what to do with those. And so we think that some of this is a start, but it still isn't really doing the heavy lift on some of this. Next slide, please. Next, in December, we talked about data collection and modeling. So there was an overview by Blake Schaefer from the US EPA. He talked about the cyan model that basically is a cyanobacteria population dynamics model that is used throughout the United States. You can see here over 2,000 of the largest lakes and reservoirs. It's based on satellite data. And the idea is basically monitoring the populations and building towards a forecasting model. So it's progressed more so in other places in the US, and the idea for Florida would be, can we look at Lake O and maybe some of the larger lakes that you can more easily collect the data based on satellite imagery. And so next slide, please. And so we were wondering how other states were utilizing this model. I was in a red tide workshop yesterday, and one thing that came up in our workshop there was, just because you build a model doesn't mean people are going to use it. So how are the end users utilizing these model outputs? hindcasting versus forecasting. So you can basically build the model and kind of predict what already happened and be like, yeah, see, you know, we built the model and it told us what happened based on the way we built the model. It's one analogy, I guess, would be that if you had a house and you took it apart and put it back together, then you would know how to build a new house. And it's not necessarily that simple. And so forecasting, predicting the future is a lot harder than looking at what happened in the past. So that's a pretty big leap, and we wanted to learn more on how well could this model predict the future. As Dr. Rosen mentioned before, not all of the cyanobacteria are sitting at the surface, and satellites are really only picking up the surface biomass. So we need to really understand what's happening below the surface. Cyanobacteria can be throughout the water column, and so that needs to be addressed. More work needs to be done on why these blooms happen. Again, as Dr. Rosen mentioned, it's a combination of nutrients and stagnant water, a stable water column that's not moving. Hurricanes seem to be a big deal. We all know this from various points of view, but you know, after Hurricane Irma, we had the huge bloom on Lake O, stirring things up, a lot of freshwater inputs and nutrient inputs into the lake. The nutrient inputs in the lakes doubled and tripled and you know, over the next 6 months because of the discharges that went into Lake Okeechobee. So those are big acute events. Are they being incorporated into the model? It seems like they should be. And then lastly, what were the data gaps and the needs? You know, what other information do we need to improve our ability to understand why these blooms happen and to really be able to build a forecasting model so we can be better prepared for when these blooms happen and maybe have a better chance of taking action while the blooms are still small before they get out of control. Next slide, please. And then in February, we talked about sewage and on-site treatment and disposal systems. And part of this had to do with the Clean Waterways Act, looking at septic to sewer conversions. And so there was an overview of what funding was now available to help these conversions, an overview of some of the different nutrient reduction technologies. One thing that everybody needs to realize, and we got educated on this as a task force, was that a septic tank is not designed to reduce nutrients. A septic tank is designed to reduce the pathogen risk to people. And so it basically reduces the bad bacteria and reduces our exposure to bad bacteria that can make us sick. They were not originally designed to reduce nutrients. So we can't expect a traditional septic tank to reduce nutrients. So there are more advanced systems that can reduce nutrients, but they're expensive. They require much more maintenance than the current sewer systems that are thousands of them, tens of thousands of them throughout the state. And so that's going to be a pretty heavy lift if we want different residents, different regions to be able or to have them switch over to some of these more advanced systems. This also leads into rulemaking efforts. There was an overview on how the Florida Department of Health was in charge of septic tanks and their inspections and permitting. That's been transferred over to the DEP, primarily to recognize that the bigger concern now is the nutrient loading of septic tanks rather than the pathogen risk. Even though this was handed over to the DEP, there are the field technicians and the people out throughout the state are still Department of Health employees. So there still is this cross-agency, I guess, not resistance isn't the right word, but incompatibility, where they basically are wearing different hats and following different rules. So that needs to be worked through still. And so our responses to this, again, the overwhelming number, and where do we need to prioritize the efforts? We can't put everybody on sewer. We can't put sewer lines everywhere. We can't expect the people that cannot hook up to a sewer line to use an advanced septic system everywhere. So how are we going to prioritize where to put in new sewer lines, where to hook people up to sewer, and where we need to have these advanced septic systems? There also is an overview from the Office of Environmental Accountability and Transparency, basically what their role was in helping to facilitate and fund research and monitoring. And again, we went back to how do we prioritize things? There has been no discussion about the legacy nutrients, all the nutrients that are sitting down in the lake sediments, and there's a lot. So is that going to be addressed at any point? And then we had another discussion about, well, how can modeling help here? What types of models and what would the goals of these models be? Would they be water flow models, nutrient models, algal models? And how would they come into play here? Next slide, please. So that's basically an overview of the meetings we had. We haven't had a meeting since February, and we canceled our May meeting. And our next one right now looks like it's going to be in August. So, we were hoping to meet more frequently and basically continue to evaluate how the Clean Waterways Act is being implemented, how the DEP and other agencies are taking our recommendations, and are we finding these hotspots? Are we identifying these hotspots? Are we prioritizing where we should take action? So I think there's been some steps taken, but clearly much more work needs to be done, as these last two bullets indicate here. I think I'm done, but next slide, please. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Parsons. That was great to get the kind of scope of what all is being looked at, and appreciate all the detailed examples. I'll now open this up for questions. We have about 5 minutes for questions.
Dr. Parsons, Ken Doherty, a county commissioner in Charlotte County, retired civil engineer for about 10 years now. So I participated in many of those stormwater designs that took place in the early 80s and 90s. I'm curious though, has the science shown that we're better off going with more of a vegetated type? At the beginning of the design process in the 80s, we designed these big ponds, deep pools, minimal littoral shelves, just enough to down by the control structures. Is it looking now like the science is showing most of these need to be vegetated?
Yeah, that would be a good general transition. I think it's not, as you know, it's not going to be appropriate everywhere, but that seems to be one that people are gravitating towards. But I think there needs to be further steps on that, because the vegetation basically will absorb the nutrients. But if the vegetation dies and goes back in the pond, the nutrients just go right back into the pond.
Yeah, I think it's quite honestly, it's the plants, the plants that we put in there are going to be so critical. We kind of controlled the cattail population, and you're right, they die off, you get BOD problems, all that stuff. So yeah, I see what you're saying, but I just think that that may be something we really need to work on as a state, get the science, getting to the water management districts. And this is where I really wanted to ask you too, as a task force, it's all going to take money, the financing for all this. I mean, huge amount of money. Yeah. And I think the places where we can best focus those dollars is a regional approach. We have 5 water management districts. And I think that's really one of the messages you guys can take back to the governor and others, is that we really need to figure out how to boost the budgets for the 5 water management districts so that they can cooperatively fund to the local governments and do things like we're working right now on at Peace River, Minnesota Regional Water Supply Authority with SwiftMud. We get a lot of cooperation from them on water supply, but from the water quality standpoint, South Florida and Southwest Florida, they could really use a boost in funding from the legislature so that more of these programs and these things we're trying to address can get funded cooperatively with the local government. Just trying to share that with you, sir.
Right, yeah, thank you very much. And you know, along those same lines, it's kind of interesting, and I don't know how this decision was made, but when the task force was put together and the chief science officer position was created, basically it all fell under the DEP. And I thought we would pretty much be kind of executive level still, not necessarily meeting with the governor on a regular basis, but looking more across agency, but it pretty much all goes through the DEP. And so, looking at the funding sources, that'd be an interesting recommendation. And I'll talk to Mark Rains, the chief science officer, and see if there could be any traction there, or if there's a political reason why, as we all know, politics play a huge role in what actually happens. If there's strategic reasons for this, it was easier or whatnot. But I agree with you 100%.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Any other questions or comments? Any online?
I had a question, Alice White, City of Northport. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
go ahead.
Yes. You mentioned the importance, or I think the underestimated importance of plants and how they absorb the nutrients. Currently, yes, we've been using retention ponds, but for the most part, nothing is planted around the edges. I know in Northport, we have citizens that are constantly concerned about how the city continues to mow along all of our canals and ditches. And they're saying if they just let some of that vegetation grow, it would absorb those nutrients before they head into the canals, which eventually we all know it heads into the Gulf. So would you say that maybe that is a way to start that really is not as expensive as some of these other options, that just by putting plants along the existing retention ponds and letting, just not mowing so
Right.
extensively, that maybe that would actually save money because if we wouldn't be mowing so much and bring some of those plants back?
Right. I'd first say that the retention ponds and the aquatic plants would not be my field of expertise.
Okay.
I'm not comfortable giving a firm answer. I do think it deserves a closer look, and I bet it will work great in at least some cases. I think that my bigger concern that I feel comfortable discussing is that I think you're going to have to harvest these plants to a certain degree, because otherwise they're just going to, when they die or whatnot, that biomass and the nutrients are just going to cycle right back into the pond. So I think the idea would be, could you be removing that biomass? So I don't mind them mowing, but if they could remove the grass clippings that they mowed, or removing the leaf litter instead of having them go into, and that's now where you start getting expensive, and so would there be, I'd be interested in learning more about how other either researchers, experts, or even people that have read up way more on this subject. Somebody must have looked at, what plants would be the best nutrient absorbers and easiest to harvest. So you basically get those nutrients completely away from the system. But I think that's the right track, and I think we should be looking at that more. And I did see James Douglas put in something in the chat, fellow FGCU professor. We have people like Serge Thomas who are looking into this pretty extensively. And other countries I know are doing it. And there are other researchers that know a lot about this. But I think that's something that we should all be looking at more closely. Now, whether that be a state level, would that be a county level, city level? Could some of these funding programs through DEP help with this? Maybe. So there might be some opportunities to really look at this more closely.
Thank you. Because it just seems that some of our practices are counterproductive. Like you said, they mow, but yes, they don't go back and pick up the clippings because that would be really labor intensive to do that. So that the dead vegetation finds its way into back into our waterways. And currently, there's spraying done to kill the vegetation that's in there, and then they come by and scoop it up, and it's very labor intensive. And then people, of course, that's when I get phone calls, because that dead vegetation sits there for a while. So
Yeah,
there
yeah,
this
that's, they shouldn't do this.
created a problem where there wasn't one, because they were live plants that were just growing there, and they would continue to grow. But they come along and spray it, they die, and it takes a while for them to come back and scoop it all out. So
Yeah, some better skip the spraying and some mechanical removal while they're
yeah,
alive.
right,
That's I
right.
think that's the way to go. And then have it grow back, so you're basically pruning, if you were.
Right. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
I'm gonna touch on that because that it's close to the heart. So Mary Ann Martin's been in business for 41 years. When she bought the marina, and she's expanded, of course, you could wade in the water and fish on Lake Okeechobee. You could basically see your feet like if you're at the beach. The bottom of the lake is limestone. You don't see that now. If I take you out on the boat, I always ask everybody this question: what color is the water? They say dark brown. Perfect. Love to hear that. I lay down on the pontoon boat, stick my arm 2 feet in the water, take a bottle of water. I stick it in there, pull it out, and you go, oh my God, didn't realize that. It's lighter than ginger ale. The reality is what you're seeing is the murkiness from the sediment. So as what she's talking about, as you spray that vegetation and that decay or the clippings go in the water, what you realize is, and don't get me wrong, it's not just about spraying or the clippings, because you have a natural decay, but it's compounding. And I'll just use Lake Okeechobee because I'm somewhat of an expert there. It's compounding year after year, decade after decade. You no longer can wade in the water on Lake Okeechobee. You no longer see the limestone. So the reality is sometimes you're riding through there and you'll see bubbles come up. They're not the nano bubbles that they've been talking about. They're actually methane gas from the decomposing material from the aquatic vegetation. And I know that Mr. Douglas spoke earlier about losing 4,400 acres of seagrass, which is it's needed for their watershed. On Lake Okeechobee, we've lost over 50,000 acres of its natural filter for multiple reasons. It's from storms and high waters and the turbidity in the water. But the reality is, as that wind shifts the water column, the sediment on the bottom of that lake gets stirred up, and now you've lost that photosynthesis process. We've lost that vegetation. So once again, as we talk about different things, she's talking about doing things that are counterproductive. If you told your child to clean up their room and all they kept doing is sticking dirty clothes up under the bed and sweeping up under the rug, at some point you're going to go in there and say, why is your rug like this, right? You hadn't done anything. You just kind of hidden the problem. And that's what we're doing with whether it's spraying, decaying, mulching, and it going back in. We're not taking what's out of there. And he mentioned an important word earlier called legacy nutrients, and we'll use it in the lake. I can't tell you the metric tons that are in there, but if you don't address those metric tons that are there, economically, are you really just shifting money around, but you're doing the same thing over and over again, trying different stuff, but you're not getting to the solution. So,
Exactly.
Sorry I get ranting, but I'm telling you, I'm passionate about Lake Okeechobee because I always feel that Lake Okeechobee is almost the blame for every water quality issue that we face on the east and west coast. And the reality of that's not the case. If you look at Billy Creek and the sewer issues they have and the discharges, I mean, we got to realize that we're all part of the problem. If we can have an honest conversation, I think we can all be part of the solution. And I think that's what your program's all about, trying to make that difference. And he mentioned, Mr. Parsons, you mentioned about the agencies communicating with each other and they don't do well. And you're right. Just so that everybody in this room understands, because some people don't, when Lake Okeechobee water is discharged to the east or west coast, it's a safety issue for the levee. And now they've spent all this money, right, to fix the levee. The worst thing they ever did was fix that levee. And I'll tell you why. Because it's going to be the demise of Lake Okeechobee. When you keep the water too high on Lake Okeechobee, the rest of the vegetation that we have, those last 5,000 or 6,000 we have, they're gone. And when the lake level continues to rise and that storm comes and you're from Fort Myers Beach and the last thing that you want to see is water coming your way, I can promise you that with this new LOSM schedule at 16 and 17 feet, you will cry bloody murder of the quality of water that's going to come your way, because it's not going to be what you've been getting. And that's why it's important of all these water projects. We focus on the water projects as water leaves the lake. You know what's last? The water that comes in the lake. And one last thing, 95%, I'm preaching now, 95% of the water that enters Lake Okeechobee is from the northern watershed. But all the water quality projects are focused as it leaves the lake. Think about that. And it's so counterproductive that it just blows my mind, you know? And that's why I'm so defensive, because we inherit the water and then we have to do something with it. And everybody on CNN and every Google and Coastal Waterkeeper and so on and so forth, they point fingers, and it's not an honest conversation. And one last thing, he showed an image earlier of the 4 Lake Okeechobee vision, satellite images from NOAA, and it shows how the progression of, and I think it was Barry Rosen, Dr. Rosen, the progression of cyanobacteria. Last week on Tuesday, the Coastal Waterkeeper showed 160 acres of blue-green or cyanobacteria on Lake Okeechobee. Now it shows it neon green on the northern watershed. The following day, I was out there with different agencies, and I had 4 House representatives out there. I turned my Life 360 app on my phone, and I was following the exact same track that this neon green image is. And I asked him, I said, look in the water. What color is the water? Brown. Okay, great. Do you see any algae? No. You don't see it with the naked eye. It's there. Don't get me wrong. It's existent. But the reality is, for people that are in the tourism industry, somebody in Kentucky sees that image, picks up the phone and says, I'm canceling my reservation because the lake is loaded with algae. It's not a great, for scientific people, they understand it. But for the layman, it's very misguided, and it's tough. So sorry, I got on my rant, but
Only one last items, and I'll remind you that there's also a member update in this meeting.
I think I've said everything I can say today.
Dr. Parsons, thank you
I
so
do have
much.
I have one quick question for Dr. Parsons, is that is, you mentioned before that these lakes, particularly like I assume artificial lakes that are built, retainment ponds around the developments, that they lose their ability to sink nutrients. Why is that?
Basically, it's just what we were talking about with all the sludge ending up on the bottom of Lake O. So they just start filling in. And so organic matter it could be natural leaf litter, it could be, from lawn clippings, but just whatever the organic source is, that just starts sitting on the bottom, and then the bacteria break it down back into the nutrients. And those nutrients, now you have a nutrient source. So instead of the bacteria basically breaking everything down, and whatever plants or even algae and even cyanobacteria in that lake that would be absorbing the nutrients, there's enough in the system now that it's creating an excess nutrients that when it would be moved then downstream, depending on if it was a natural flow or water control, it's often enriched in the nutrients. So it becomes a source instead of the sink.
We can share Dr. Parsons' information for additional questions. There's surely a lot of interest in maybe a future meeting. We can focus on pond design or pond management. So I appreciate the fact that there's been a lot of interest in this topic. And Dr. Parsons, again, thank you for your presentation.
Great, thank you very much.
Move on to item number 12, funding resources for combating harmful algal blooms.